Okay, Francesca, I'm going to introduce you as one of my very, very favorite behavioral scientists. So creative, so productive. And the topic today is curiosity, appropriately enough. So with that minimal introduction, Francesca, thank you. And I'll see you again in about 25 minutes for Q&A.
Thank you. And thank you for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here and talk about piqued curiosity. What I wanted to do, despite the fact that I'm always advised not to give meta talks where you tell others what is about to happen, I'm going to break the rule and do that here so that you sort of know what's coming your way. I want to give you a sense of why I got interested in this topic, why I find it exciting, and then bring in data from 3 different sources. So it's across papers with different collaborators, and I'm going to introduce these collaborators in just a bit. But let me share the motivations for why I find this topic of curiosity and piqued curiosity in particular to be interesting. A few years ago, I found myself writing and studying the work inside of one of the best restaurants in the world. And it's something that I have shared in a book that I wrote in 2018 called The Rebel Talent. And the restaurant is called Osteria Francescana. And the reason why it piqued my interest is because it's an Italian restaurant. First time an Italian restaurant became the best restaurant in the world. But it's an Italian restaurant where the chef and owner, Massimo Bottura, decided to reinvent traditional Italian dishes. And that is quite a courageous act because there are lots of rules when it comes to cooking. We might not have a lot of rules when it comes to driving or speeding, but when it comes to cooking, we're very precise as Italians in terms of thinking about which type of pasta you pair with a type of sauce, etc. And in addition to that, when we think about traditional Italian dishes, we cherish our old ways, the recipes that have been passed on for centuries. And so the chef came into exactly this context, and he approached traditional dishes with a lot of curiosity, started saying, why is it that we cook the dish this way? Maybe it made sense 20 years ago, but not today. And he reinvented the dishes and came out with all sorts of quite innovative ways of cooking traditional Italian dishes. And there are lots of stories at the restaurant that demonstrate that he behaves in certain way to really trigger and encourage curiosity, not only in himself, but also in everybody who works in his business. The best story to me that I think really captures what curiosity can do for all of us is a story of a very busy night at the restaurant. And Bottura has a lot of diversity in his kitchen. So despite the fact that in an Italian restaurant, they have people from Japan, Mexico, United States, different parts of Europe, Canada, etc. And one of the sous chefs is known as Taka. He's obsessed with attention to details. He's Japanese. And Taka was working on the last dessert of the night. And so it was a lemon tart. He was carefully arranging all the pieces on the plate. And all of a sudden, the tart dropped to the floor. And now you had a smashed tart. And Taka was almost starting to panic. This is a 3 Michelin star restaurant, so the mistakes are quite expensive. But at that point, Chef Massimo Bottura walked into the kitchen and saw the mistake. And rather than doing what most people would have done in that moment, which is probably yelling at your sous chef, Bottura didn't. And he looked at the plate and then he looked up at Taka and said, Taka, I think we have a new idea for a new dessert. And sure enough, they come up with a new dessert. It's a deconstructed lemon tart. And it's now the most popular dessert at the restaurant. And the reason why I love this story is because it's a beautiful example of what curiosity can do for us if we're able to leverage that curiosity in every single interaction. In this case, rather than seeing the destroyed tart, he was able to see something different, to ask, what could this be? And in his mind, this could be the start for the inspiration for a new dessert. And the name of this dessert on the menu is, Oops, I Dropped the Lemon Tart. Now, as it turns out, when we look at data on curiosity, what this shows is that many people see the benefits of it. In fact, just to mention some of the data that my colleagues and I collected, we did a survey with over 3,000 people. And what we saw is that the majority of them, in fact, to be precise, 92% of them credited curious people for being the one who bring new ideas into organizations or into the group, the ones that really push boundaries and create something new and innovative. And also, these same people understand that curiosity is really important to a lot of things related to the work that we do in organization, for motivation, satisfaction, high level of performance. So in a sense, this data simply shows that we see the value of curiosity. Now, this was done on employees in the United States, but when you actually do similar surveys across the globe with a more of an international set of people, same set of results. We understand what curiosity can do for us. And yet, when you ask the same people as we did, whether they feel curious on a almost day-to-day basis at work, the results are a little bit surprising, at least to me. Only a minority of them reported feeling curious in their job. And a lot of them reported facing barriers to asking questions at work. And for those of you who have children or you have images of your own childhood, you would know that one of the ways in which we show curiosity is by asking a lot of questions. And so this data really gave me pause because it got me really interested in trying to understand what it is that we could be doing to be curious more often, given that curiosity has so many benefits, and to try to understand how maybe through small interventions, we could raise curiosity in the moment for people such that we don't see the same amount of barriers that we currently see when it comes to rely on curiosity. And so what I want to do is tell you a little bit about the research that I've been doing over the last many months, and in fact, in a case, even years. And I want to talk about data that comes from two different papers. And in my mind, the two papers are actually somewhat related, but it's for you to judge. The first paper is very much at the early stage, and it's a paper with two amazing collaborators, Bushra here at HBS, a wonderful doctoral student I have the privilege to work with, and Spencer Harrison at INSEAD, who has done a lot of work in the context of curiosity in organizations. And this paper looks at ways in which our own curiosity, when we reach out to other people, can be viewed as not instrumental, and what that might do to the type of relationship that we develop at work. The second paper, which is a little bit more seasoned in the sense that we really have been working on it for quite a few years now, partly because we were doing interventions in a large Canadian bank. It's a paper in collaboration with a group of colleagues at the University of Toronto, Tiziana Casciaro, Bill McEvely, and Evelyn Zhang. And it's data that leverages both an intervention in a real organization as well as intervention with working professionals that come from many different organizations. Now, let me talk about the first paper, and I'm going to focus on one study for the first paper and hopefully a couple of quick studies for the second one. For the first paper, we were wondering whether what curiosity can do is sort of allowing us to do what we were doing when we were little kids. Again, if you have memories of when you were a little child, or I'm the mom of four, so I'm in the land of curiosity with a lot of questions that are being asked. And when I think about the way my kids often express their curiosity, they start with, I wonder, or I'm curious about, and then they ask their questions or they make their statements. And it's interesting that it seems like a very gentle way of expressing curiosity. And so in this project, we're interested in looking at way of expressing curiosity versus not, but also ways of using language to express curiosity, like I wonder, or I'm curious about, what effect that has on the perceptions that others have on us. And the reason is that one of the things that is interesting about the data on curiosity in children, I'm not behind that data, but I'm an avid consumer, is that it shows that curiosity is very natural, and then it sort of declines. In fact, the peak is around the age 4 and 5, and then there is sort of a decline. And the decline seems to be in line with the fact that as we grow older, we become very concerned about what others think of us. And so we're focused on the impressions that we're making rather than just asking questions with a lot of freedom without worrying about judgment. And so we thought that when we ask questions with the I wonder or I'm curious about, when we're expressing curiosity, the perceptions that others have of us is very different. So we started with a study that is incredibly simple. And in fact, if you have ideas about how is it that we could have further study on this that also include interventions, my ears are wide open, since I'm very curious about your own ideas on how to best conduct the research. But what we did that was very, very simple is asking people to do a recall task. So we were asking them to think back to an interaction in which a colleague asked them for information. And maybe you're thinking about this yourself. There are all sorts of ways or all sorts of interaction that I can think of where the question asked was expressed with curiosity versus not. And then after people described the interactions in details, we asked them to assess the curiosity that this colleague that they just wrote about expressed. And we did that with very simple items. So how curious was that person, how interesting was that person, and how inquisitive was that person. And after that, we asked people to evaluate the target of the interactions. And as I said, we were interested in particular in understanding instrumentality, but also the enjoyment and the liking of that relationship. So as you can see from this simple study, this is correlational, is something that I'm presenting as a way of generating ideas and questions for discussions. But we're looking at a very simple way to start almost on the project. And what we saw in terms of results is that as we hypothesized, expressed curiosity is in fact linked to being perceived less instrumental. So it's quite interesting and in my mind important, because lowering perception of instrumentality, I think, can allow us to develop stronger and more meaningful relationship that we can rely on when we need support and help in organizations. But what we also see from this simple correlational study is that expressed curiosity is also positive correlated with more liking as well as more enjoyment of the interaction and the likelihood or the willingness or the desire to have a future interaction. We also ran a mediation analysis, again, despite the fact that this is a very simple study, and consistent with our initial predictions, what we see is that expressed curiosity leads to more likely, more enjoyment, and also the desire for future interactions through the mechanism of lowering perceptions of instrumentality. Again, this is just at the beginning of a research project, but hopefully I'm giving you some thoughts for questions that you might ask, since that would be really helpful to us as we keep exploring this research. And again, the bigger picture is to allow for people through hopefully some interventions in organizations to reach out to others or ask their questions differently, such that they're not perceived as instrumental or are perceived as less instrumental, and they have more of a support network, if you will, when it's time to ask for support and help from their colleagues, with benefits potentially for their performance and also for their creative ideas. Now, let me shift a bit to telling you about data for the second project. And it's actually, as I said, in my mind, very, very related. I was struck by the fact that I've seen curiosity in a lot of different organizations where interactions seem to be quite successful, where collaborations seem to happen quite effectively. And one such place where I had the opportunity to spend some time is Pixar Animation Studios, where if you are sitting in one of their brainstorming sessions, you hear a lot of curiosity about each other's ideas, rather than what I often see in meetings that I'm part of, where we are hearing ideas and often maybe too quickly thinking about why it is that they might not be working. So they had a really interesting way of not only being quite effective in their idea generations, but also being quite effective in terms of the way those present, no matter how experienced they are, they collaborate effectively with one another. And when we look more broadly about the issue of collaboration, it's something that is critical to achieving all sorts of good outcomes. In fact, whenever people are trying to work on complex problems, they often do so while working with others so that they can leverage each other's differences to get to interesting solutions. I am definitely a person who benefited a lot in my past, in my different collaborations with great colleagues around the world. And so the question here was, given that collaborations can be so important, can organizations and their leaders do something to trigger it more often, especially when it comes in the form of networking across organizational boundaries? So it's reaching out to people who are different from you, sit in different parts of the organizations, and who could, again, be beneficial in terms of putting their heads together and solve complex problems. And as we thought of this question in the work with Tiziana, Bill, and Evelyn, we thought that curiosity was a really good candidate. Curiosity is something that gives us the motivation potentially to overcome all sorts of boundaries, to what we refer to as boundary spanning networking. And the label is way too academic, but that's how the literature refers to it. But really think about collaborations across boundaries, across silos, across functions. Could curiosity be this engine that really increases our desire to reach out to people more broadly? And in a sense, even from the definition, it was suggestive that there might be this possibility. Since curiosity is this desire to acquire new information of knowledge, and again, often in organization, this information and knowledge is in the hands of colleagues who are sitting somewhere else. And for this project, we were particularly interested in interventions that we, together in a sense with the organizations, could do to trigger curiosity in the moment. So curiosity has been studied a lot in psychology as a trait, but there is also some more recent research that suggests that curiosity can be triggered in the moment through some simple intervention. Most of the interventions have occurred in the lab. And so what we were also trying to do in our work is demonstrate that curiosity can be effectively triggered in an organization with effects that are lasting beyond the minutes or hour after you've actually triggered. And so our hypothesis for this research were very simple. We are hypothesizing that piquing curiosity, so triggering it in the moment, increase this type of collaboration, so increase this boundary spanning networking. And in particular, which is something that we could explore in one of our studies, it does that in two ways. It's increasing, again, using some of the terms in the literature, first order boundary spanning, as well as a second order boundary spanning. And what that means is that you're interacting outside your own group, but also you're interacting with people who are not connected to one another. So let me talk at a high level with a slide that has a lot of text, but there are a few things that I want to draw your attention to. The studies that we were able to conduct. And then in this case, I'm going to focus on the studies that are easier to explain, but happy to dig deeper during the question from the study that we conducted in the organization. So the first study was a field experiment where we recruited working professionals across different organizations. And very simply, we had two conditions, a curiosity condition and then a control conditions. And we gathered our own data for the dependent variables through surveys. So this is not real networking, but it's their own recollections of the networking that happened during the time of the study, as well as their networking intentions going forward. The second study is pretty much the same as the first one, with the addition of looking at potential mechanisms that might explain why piqued curiosity leads to more boundary spanning networking. And finally, and maybe with more excitement, we did a field experiments on middle managers inside of a large bank in Canada. And what we were able to do there that is different from the other field studies is three important things. First, we had a third condition. So not only we had the curiosity condition and the control condition, but we also had what we called an engagement condition. So people who received still email messages, but they were neutral, and the people in the control condition received nothing. Second, we don't look at intentions for networking or self-reports through surveys, but we actually have the email exchanges from the organizations. So a more objective measure of what is happening as a result of piqued curiosity in people reaching out to others in the organizations. And third, what is also interesting is that is data from the same organization looking at intervention that lasted for 3 weeks. And so we're also able to look at how long lasting is this intervention, which is something that we couldn't do in the first two studies. So very quickly, I'm going to tell you about the methods of the first study. And differently from what we might be used to, the specific wording for triggering curiosity is the same across the three studies. So if you have problems with it from study one, you're going to see it across all studies. So in the first study, this field experiments with working professionals, we collected data through survey at time one, where we looked at the big five, as well as, actually that's the only thing that we looked at is the big five. And we don't see any differences across conditions in terms of those characteristics. Then we had our intervention, and what that was a text message that people received on Monday and Wednesday for 4 weeks. And after that, we had our dependent measures, and what we collected there is self-reports for the frequency of professional networking, the new connections that people made, the number of relationships that they had nurtured over that 4 weeks, and also their intentions for networking in the future. And so have a look at how we measure, we raise the piqued curiosity. So in the curiosity group, in the email, we asked, what is one topic or activity that you're curious about today? What is the thing that you usually take for granted that you want to ask about? Please make sure that you ask a few whys as you engage in your work throughout the day. Please set aside a few minutes to identify how you'll approach your work today with these questions in mind. So that's how we felt we could raise curiosity. We had run some pilots data to show that this actually is an effective intervention in order to raise curiosity. And we also have a manipulation check in the second study. And instead, in the engagement group is just a neutral email asking what's one topic or activity that you engage in today. what is one thing they usually work on or do that you'll also complete today. So let's look at some results. And for easiness, I am putting all the results in the same slides, despite the fact that some of them are scales and some of them is actually measure of their estimated number of relationships. And so if you look at the frequencies of how they network, as well as self-reported new connections that they made, as well as a self-reported number of the relationship that they nurtured, as well as the other measures in terms of future intentions of networking. Across all of these measures, we find significant differences in the way that we expected, meaning that when people received those messages throughout the 4 weeks, they reported being more interested in engaging in networking in the future, but also according to their self-reports, they nurtured their existing relationship as well as creating new connections in the last month. Now, we replicated this study with a very similar procedure in study 2, where again, we went with working professionals across different organizations. We had a similar intervention, but at a shorter period of time. So this times we had the intervention running for 2 weeks. And then once again, we asked the same questions in terms of dependent measures. But what was different in this study is that we were looking and interested to see what mechanisms might explain these results. And what we decided to focus on was the idea of understanding what it is that this curiosity is triggering them to do. And the ideas that we had that are the things that we ended up measuring is looking at reaching out to people because they want to learn more about how the work is done. Or maybe they perceive the cost of bridging to be different. Or maybe they're just interested in socializing. And so same manipulation as we used in the past in terms of our email interventions. And if you look at the results, what the results show is that there are differences across a lot of the dimensions that we measured in terms of replicating the results, but also adding some nuance in terms of these mechanisms. And maybe the most important aspect of this study is looking at demediation results, where what we see is that as compared to this control condition, the reason why we see people being more interested in networking in the future is through 2 things. One, an interest in connecting with colleagues for work reasons. And the other is interested in learning about work through other sources. So when we look at other potential mechanisms, the only 2 that stood out are these 2 mechanisms. And the instead mechanisms that didn't seem to make a difference in terms of mediation explaining our effects are curiosity about meaning of work, the desire to socialize, this perceived cost of bridging, as well as curiosity about how to accomplish work. As I told you, there is also a 3rd study, but it's much more complex to explain. And the only thing that I'm going to say about the 3rd study that I'm not presenting is that in an environment that, again, the N is much larger, the people are all from the same organizations, what we find is that even in the context of a condition, an added condition where there is no emailing, we still replicate the same type of effects that we see here. And the dependent measure is more objectives because we actually see by leveraging the email data who people reached out to. And so we can say that they went outside their own group, consistent with our hypothesis, and they also connected with people that are not connected to one another. And finally, the effect doesn't last forever. In fact, we see a decline at about 3 weeks after the interactions. So let me pause here and end with a big thank you, but I'm really curious to hear, genuinely curious to hear your questions and thoughts that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesca. Amazing. We have lots of questions, and I'm going to start with the top liked question, which is from Melanie Miller, who asks, how is curiosity measured? Is there a standard scale? Is it for trait or state? How does it relate to personality traits like need for cognition? Sorry for all the questions. I'm curious.
Love it. So really good question. So Todd Kashdan would be the person I would mention who's done tremendous amount of work, really beautiful work on how to think about how to measure curiosity. And I also love the fact that he used to have a measure to get at trait curiosity, and then he, over the last few years, updated it. And so there is a concept of stretching in curiosity and also embracing. So I'm happy to share some links that you can make available to people, but he's the person who I would refer to for trait curiosity. In most of our research, we trigger it in the moment. And that is where we would have to, especially in the second paper, where we had to be a little bit creative ourselves, since some of the work on curiosity had been done just in the lab. So Spencer Harrison, for example, had done really cool work in the lab to rate curiosity. And one of the interesting manipulation is to tell people about a famous magic trick by Harry Houdini, and you read through it, and then you're asked to guess how is it that you might have been able to do it. And so people write their answers, and in the control condition, they tell you that you didn't get it right. And in the curiosity condition, they let you wander for a while. So in a sense, they don't put an end to that curiosity, and they're able to show that in subsequent tasks, that curiosity stays. But for us, given that we were emailing people, it was in an organizational context, we wanted something maybe a little bit stronger. And so that's why we came up with the language that you saw in the manipulation, where we're asking people just think about the what if and why type questions. Curiosity as a trait is linked to other personality traits. So for example, it is negatively correlated with need for cognition. It is positive correlated with openness to new experiences. But again, there is a lot of work, some of which we have also done, that shows that they're actually distinct. That the power of curiosity in predicting important behaviors is quite unique, even if you control for these other factors. I have some data from the bank where we looked at curiosity as a trait, and we were able to show that it was the best predictor of how people move throughout their careers and the best predictor of performance, despite the fact that there were other personality traits being measured.
John Bogard asks, sometimes curiosity feels good, for example, receiving a letter from a secret admirer. Sometimes curiosity feels awful, for example, awaiting the results of a big test you just took. What moderates the valence of the affective experience of curiosity?
So it's interesting. It's true that curiosity doesn't always have that positive feeling. And in fact, if I go to some of the work by George Lowenstein on this, it's almost as if there is ambivalence because you want to know, but you have this desire that is, again, not necessarily positive. I am not sure whether the literature has looked at whether the emotional positivity, negativity, or valence of it exacerbates the effects, reduces the effects. And if others in the audience know about it, and so I'm not thinking of studies that exist out there, please put a note, since I would love to see those papers. It's an interesting question. I think it's just this, more than the negativity or the positivity, what's important is this desire of wanting to know, not necessarily because you want to learn something, because you want to grab that information and that knowledge.
Wanting to know more. Aryeh Kuglansky, I think, has said a little bit about the valence thing, if anybody wants to look it up. Okay, so a very popular question was posed by Amit Kumar, who asks, piquing curiosity suggests an intervention along the lines of a push that is motivating people to be more curious at work, and maybe that's what you did. And yet your data suggests that employees report facing barriers to asking questions. Do you think that interventions that focus on increasing motivation are distinct from methods focusing on removing barriers? And if so, which approach do you think would be more beneficial?
This is I love the question because it's also quite broad, and I can think of it in the case of different nudges. So I think, like possibly many behavioral scientists who are part of this conversation, that system level changes can be truly powerful. So if you can change something in the system and nudge people in that way, can generate a lot of benefits. And I often think about those system level changes as removing barriers. And I'd be curious, Angela, whether you have the same way of thinking, but that's how I think, that I think about, I know that there are some barriers and I go into organization and remove them out of a totally very different context. The one that is coming in mind for me, since I was working with an organization recently about that, is in performance reviews. And they had people have a self-assessment, and then they had the managers write the review, and there was a lot of bias, both racial and gender bias. And so the system level changes was remove the self-assessment so that the managers actually give the review and guide them through some questions that we know are helpful in removing bias. But what I am left not satisfied with sometimes is that system level changes take time. And I often feel bad for the individuals who are waiting. And so I feel that often there is the potential for people themselves to ask the why or what if type questions in this case, such that they can still make some good progress. And so I feel that nudges that where we're asking the individuals to do something different, in that case, it's easier to work on the motivation, if you will, rather than removing the barriers. I'm curious, Angela, whether you're thinking about this.
I was like, oh no, I want to talk to you about it, but I also want to read the other questions. Well, I'll just say that, like, that's a very interesting point that you brought up, Francesca, whether systemic change is more about removing barriers than increasing motivation, and individual change on the flip side of that would be more about nudging, increasing motivation, or making it easier, but not removing barriers. Like I hadn't thought about that, those going together. That particular, I mean, obviously there are examples of systemic change which are not exactly in those categories. Anyway, so how about to be continued?
To be continued. Really interesting question.
Both of our curiosities been piqued. We should work on that together. Okay. Florian Bonnet or Bonnet asks, are there any cultural components or cultural differences, I guess, for curiosity or the propensity to be curious?
Yes, the data is tough to collect. And so again, if you have ideas, happy to join forces on this one. So I feel that if I put my strict scientist hat on, I don't feel super confident about my answer other than bringing in some related data. So for example, there is a beautiful paper by Jenny Chapman at the University of Berkeley and colleagues that has looked at how a set of companies performed during the financial crisis. And what she found was that if adaptability was one of the values that the company was after, then in their culture, then they fared much better. And in some of the work that I've done, when you're curious, it is much easier to adapt and to embrace a change because you're looking at the positive rather than being stuck to the constraints of the negative. So, but it's not a direct answer to the question. I think it's a fascinating one to study.
Okay, this may be our last one. Sunita Sa, who I believe is a professor at Cornell, asked, what are your thoughts, Francesca, on assessing curiosity during an interview process?
Mm-hmm. So there are some examples that I shared in the book when I was talking about curiosity as one of the rebel talents. And one of them in a business context is to ask people what industries or organizations are they following. And so if the answer is a person who's just saying, I'm following this organization and maybe just another one that is a direct competitor, probably not a lot of curiosity. But if the person is expansive in their interest, then I think you can pick up a little bit of the curiosity. Also pay attention to whether they're just answering questions or asking questions of you, since one of the behavioral elements that show that you're in fact curious is that you're asking a lot of questions. And so if it's just, despite it's an interview, if it's just very much a person asking question and you responsive, then probably not a great example of curiosity. I was watching last week an interview by Debbie Millman, since I'm going to have the chance to interview her soon for case studies for HBS. And there was this beautiful moment where she was being interviewed and then she kept asking questions, and you almost turned around where the interviewer was not the person being interviewed, but it was just a great example of curiosity.
Terrific. Well, our very curious audience has many more questions, but I think it is time to say thank you so much, Francesca. I also love that you invited pretty much all of the 600 people to be your collaborator, and I think that says a lot about you. Katie, I think you are able to announce next week. Do you want to give it a go?
Hear me? Can you hear me? Yeah,
I can. Okay, you know what, Katie, we can't hear you well enough. So sorry about that. I am going to announce next week. Francesca, I hope you can join us when Susan Athey, a week from today, from Stanford University, gives a talk on designing and analyzing behavioral experiments with machine learning. So we're all curious to know what Susan will be telling us. And Katie's definitely going to have better bandwidth by then. And Francesca, thank you again. Fantastic talk. And just, you're such a curious and creative scientist. I will share with everyone that Francesca has a race car. What? And used to ride motorcycles. So, you know, you'll never stop asking questions, Francesca. We hope to see you again soon.
Thank you so much.
All right, bye-bye.